Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So, one of the things I'm trying to explore in this podcast is the idea of a book as a journey. A book can take you different places, it can open up new opportunities, it can allow you to engage and interact with new people. And when writing the book, The Islamic Mary, I've got the opportunity to travel different places, speak at different conferences, universities, and I've got to meet a lot of really interesting people. One of them is Asma Afsaruddin, who is the editor of the Oxford Handbook on Islam and Women. As I was writing the book on the Islamic Mary, I was really interested in this idea of women in the Quran. And as I started looking at the handbook and the 32 different articles within it, I stumbled upon her article, which I found extremely fascinating and interesting. So for today, I'm going to interview Asma Sardine about her edited volume, how she put the volume together, her particular article, and the implications that her work may have on modern Muslims and global society. And with that, my interview with Asma Sardine. I want to thank Dr. Asma Afsaruddin for joining the Islamic Mary podcast. Asma Afsaruddin is someone who I look up to as a role model, and recently she's written this really important book, edited, called Oxford Handbook on Islam and Women. So I look forward to engaging that more with you today. So welcome, Asma Afsaruddin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation.
Absolutely. So, Asma, you're someone I've been following for a long time and enjoy reading your books, whether that's on jihad or the early Muslim community to now Islam and women. So, could you speak about your most recent edited volume, the Oxford Handbook of Islam and Women, its goals, purposes, and themes?
So, one of the main purpose was to capture the diversity of Muslim women's lives and experiences through time and in different geographical spaces, regions of the world. And the chapters in their entirety, I would argue, easily challenge the stereotypical images of Muslim women that are so endemic in the Western media and even in the Western academy to this day. Now, Muslim women, if you look at the history of Muslim women's participation in their own societies, they have been and they continue to be scholars and teachers and leaders in different spheres of social life. They have been and continue to be engaged in business and entrepreneurial activities of various kinds, and therefore contributing to the economic well being of their societies. And history shows us that wealthy women typically were often heavily engaged in charitable activities. And an important part of their charitable activities was to endow important institutions like madrasas, and that in the pre-modern period were actually institutions of higher learning. They endowed hospitals, orphanages, and other charitable institutions of the kind. Muslim women's literary contributions have also been substantial, and perhaps that's better documented than other activities, especially the economic activities, because we do have their extant writings, primarily poetry, even starting from the pre-Islamic period, but also during the Abbasid period, as one of the chapters point out, they actually made enormous contributions to the literary culture of the time. They've also been warriors. And this is something that we can retrieve from historical works, from the Hadith literature, where women's participation in actual battles. And of course, they've always contributed to charitable work, humanitarian assistance on the battlefield, but they were actually also engaged, some of them, not this was by no means a common occurrence, but some of them were engaged as well in actual combat. And they were then given the equal share of the spoils on a par with the men. They've also been important political actors in their own right. And of course, the earliest example that comes to mind is that of Aisha, the widow of the Prophet. But then we have other examples through history, as one chapter points out. There are the Begums of Bhopal in the Indian subcontinent. There's been Benazir Bhutto and other women heads of state in the modern period. And the volume specifically starts off with discussing specific verses from the Quran that have to do with women and examines the commentary literature that has grown up around these verses from the 8th century onward, and provides a robust engagement with the views of male exegetes, mostly from the pre-modern period, and then contraposes them to the views of modern Muslim women exegetes. And one of the purposes for doing that is to highlight the phenomenon that we call Islamic feminism, which became a movement, quite a robust movement from the late, I would say, well, maybe late 19th century is too early, but from the 20th century onward. Other chapters in the handbook deal with the hadith and legal literature that provide rules that have guided and impacted women's lives in different settings. By foregrounding all these activities of women through different time periods and in different parts of the world, it hopefully achieves one of the goals of the handbook, which was to foreground women's voices and their agency as they not only engage these different sources, the Quran and the Hadith and the legal literature and so forth, but also as they interpreted them and revisited the traditional meanings that have been assigned to a number of these sources.
Wow, that's amazing. I definitely felt that reading the volume where you're actually hearing the voices of Muslim women, and then you're also engaging in original research regarding Muslim women and giving a voice and agency to these Muslim women scholars. So you mentioned this point about stereotypes. I'm really fascinated about that and this idea that the volume presents Muslim women as who they are, and it challenges certain stereotypes of Muslim women that are found in general culture and Western society. But you also mentioned in the academy. Could you speak more about that, about the general stereotypes that the volume is speaking towards?
Well, right. Well, one of the persistent stereotypes is that Muslim women are a monolith, that they can be discussed as in kind of undifferentiated collectivity. So if you find one Muslim woman on the street, and this is a particular beloved tactic of the media, if you find one Muslim woman on the street and you interview her, and then she's assumed to speak for all Muslim women, right? But the handbook actually deliberately casts a very broad net. We've also ventured outside of the Middle East. There's also this persistent stereotype that if you talk about Muslims, you only have to focus on the Middle East, and particularly the Arab world, right? And no one else qualifies as a real Muslim. So therefore, it perpetuates that kind of a monolithic portrayal of Muslim women. Even in the academy, I think there is a certain resistance to studying the lived realities of Muslim women. The tendency has been, and we all know the phenomenon of Orientalism, the tendency has been to simply study textual sources, particularly religious sources, and say, well, of course, this defines how Muslim women are supposed to live. And, acting as if all these are just simply imposed on women and women just passively accept them. Whereas we know that Muslim women have always kind of been engaged in the interpretive process, even if we don't actually have texts written by them preserved in the modern period, right? But we have the voice of Aisha, for example, and the other wives of the Prophet and other prominent women from the earlier period questioning and debating, how some of these decisions were made by, the prominent male elders of the community. And one of my favorite stories that actually include in my own chapter in the handbook is about how Omar was trying to restrict the mahar, the bridal dower, almost arbitrarily, right? In a public session, and an elderly woman took courage of that and took him to task for it, saying, you were trying to take away something that God himself has given us and promised in his book, right? But think of the significance of this event, that women were participating freely in these public debates, in public fora, and they were encouraged to. Omar did not rebuke this woman for having spoken up. In fact, he revised his own decision based on the woman's pronouncement. I keep referring to her as the woman because she's actually not given a name, as far as I'm aware, in the sources that I at least looked at. Maybe there is some identification of her. But Omar did not think it was out of place, and he embraced her take on this matter and revised his decision accordingly, and basically said, in some accounts, it's not necessarily repeated in every account, in some accounts he's said to have said, the older woman is right and Omar is wrong. Amazing humility, amazing intellectual humility, where it's not the gender of the person that matters, it's the fact that she's learned, and her decision was then deemed by Omar to be more appropriate than his own. And therefore, he accepted that as a better alternative, as a better exegesis of the matter at hand. But those stories don't gain much currency or circulation. And there are many others. We have Aisha remonstrating in some of the sources against the views of Abu Huraira, for example, right? But they're really only limited to people who are, scholars who are actually engaged in this matter. And they're not very well known outside of those limited circles. So it continues to be a problem. And certainly journalists in the global media are not seeking out these kinds of learned voices who can challenge these stereotypes.
All right, absolutely. So thanks so much for that response. So maybe you could speak a little bit about your role as the editor. I know you've written several monographs and articles, and I've had the opportunity to read them. And now you've playing a separate role as an editor. Could you speak to the audience about what is an editor? What did you do? How did you compile all these different articles? How did you define the subjects? Who will write for what, and so forth?
Yeah. Yeah, well, let me tell you right off the bat, being an editor is a lot of hard work. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And the handbook contains 34 chapters, plus an index, and plus an introduction that I had to write, which introduces the chapters at the beginning of the handbook. And then I also have to prepare like sort of thematic commentary as we move from one topic to another. So it is a lot of work, but at the same time, I have to say it turned out to be a lot of fun. So in the preliminary stage of editing the handbook, my main task was to reach out to scholars and experts in the relevant fields and invite them to contribute. Of course, the TOC, the table of contents, had been also subjected to a review by peers in my field, blind reviews, so that I didn't know who the referees were, and they offered very valuable feedback, which helped me to shape the content of the handbook. So that had already been pre-approved. So I had, basically a mandate to proceed with the work of inviting the scholars. Now, this was actually I think the kind of the fun part of the editing process, because it allowed me to reconnect with a lot of senior scholars and junior scholars in the field, some of whom I already knew, and some of whom I then got to know in the process of interacting with them while they worked on their chapters. And, I offered my own take and revisions on the chapters. And these were scholars who were at the top of their game and who were capable of approaching the topics from different methodological perspectives. The contributors, if you look at their affiliations, which are contained in the back of the book, they represent a variety of disciplinary backgrounds, primarily, of course, in the humanities and the social sciences, given the nature of the work. All but two are women. So, but I didn't want to skew it completely towards the women's authors side. So I was actually determined to get at least a couple of male contributors, and I did manage to do exactly that, because I think it is important to show that women's issues are important to all. I don't want to silo women's studies in a kind of gendered way, right? Because there are also important male authors who are contributing to this topic. And gender should be considered an important analytic tool in all our research, not only those who are narrowly focused on or more specifically focused on gender issues, but it should be considered a valuable analytic tool in all kinds of research that we carry out within the academy. So one of the particular challenges I faced was the onset of COVID in spring 2020. If you recall, it was not so long ago, basically almost everything shut down. Now, authors were already in the middle of writing their chapters, and many of them were thrown for a loop. Now, not everyone has access to a first-class library on their campuses, and we often rely on interlibrary loan service, right? So that shut down. If you remember, the libraries were pretty much shut down, as were the institutions themselves. So that did lengthen the process of writing and being able to comment on the work and producing the final versions. But I want to put in a shout out for all the contributors who hung on there, produced wonderful work that finally saw the light of day last year, their commitment to the project was exemplary, and we all pulled together despite the pandemic. So if you will notice that in the acknowledgement section of the handbook, I actually have much high praise for the joint efforts that we made to get to the finish line. The whole
Absolutely.
experience was also quite educational as well for me. I learned so much from my contributors, especially in the section in which we catalog and analyze women's religious and social activism in different modern countries. The chapter authors brought a wealth of firsthand knowledge and expertise to bear on their discussion of so many different regions in the Muslim majority and Muslim minority world. Of course, that included the Middle East, but also South and Southeast Asia, China, North America, and Western Europe, among others. Now, I anticipate that this section, which draws from fieldwork and ethnography, will prove to be of considerable interest to Middle Eastern social scientists who work at the intersection of religion and lived social and cultural realities, but cannot often go to the Middle East themselves for various reasons. Another important consideration was the thematic grouping of the chapters, which I referred to already. And the final section of the handbook is, I hope, an important contribution to the field because it focuses on how Muslim women, their clothing, their lifestyle choices, etc., how they're often weaponized in specific political and academic discourses, and especially feminist discourses in the West. And therefore, this is frequently the prism through which a Western audience views Muslim women as I mentioned earlier, as an undifferentiated collectivity, right? Apparently, I mean, according to these monolithic views, all women wear the hijab for exactly the same reason. All women embrace certain positions for exactly the same reason, right? We just don't see the nuancing of different choices that women make of their own volition after weighing their own sense of well-being and benefit, right? So again, there's this denial of agency to Muslim women, and everything is determined for them in advance, apparently. The two chapters that address this topic, how Muslim women are perceived in the international sphere, actually, I think, is very skillfully contextualize these discourses against the larger socio-political backdrop against which they're occurring. So the experiences of Palestinian women, for example, is not going to be the same as the experiences of women in Egypt or Malaysia and so forth. So I'm hoping again that the handbook as a whole will contribute to undermining these assumptions about Muslim women and their lives. And then ultimately, I have to say that editing this handbook was a highly rewarding experience. It really was, as I said, a lot of fun. And I'm really hoping that the volume will be read widely and stand the test of time.
Absolutely, yeah. I always admire the role of the editor, especially in terms of gathering all these articles, all the work and contacting them, making sure that they submit on time, reviewing them, providing feedback. It's a lot of work. So yeah, thanks so much for doing all that. So another question I had was regarding your article. So you weren't just the editor, but you also contributed to this volume. And you had this really fascinating article called Modern Rereadings of the Quran Through a Gendered Lens. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that, your argument there, your conclusion, and how it fits within the general theme of the book.
So my chapter basically provides an overall summary and an assessment of the debates in our field as to whether the Quran should be regarded as a text that upholds patriarchy or undermines it. And it critically engages with the commentaries that have been generated by modern women exegetes who self-identify as Muslim and who ponder this question as they study relevant Quranic verses and discuss the commentaries of male exegetes, primarily from the pre-modern period, but also from the modern period, on a number of key verses. So we all know the pioneers in the field, Rifat Hassan, Aziz al-Hibri, Amina Wadud, and Asma Barlas. They ultimately retrieve an egalitarian an empowering message for women from the Quran. But more recently, a handful of Muslim gender scholars have questioned this conclusion, and they've essentially argued that either the Quran has both hierarchical and non hierarchical verses, or promotes a hierarchical society generally, and that one cannot maintain the absolute gender egalitarianism of the text. I've been intrigued by these debates for a long time, but I've never really gotten around to, examining the textual sources for myself and coming to a conclusion on my own. Well, the handbook offered me an opportunity to do just that. So in the context of writing this chapter, one of the purposes I had in mind was to decide for myself which of these positions, should be considered supportable. So I examined the relevant textual sources that included, of course, the Quranic verses, related hadith, but also primarily the exegetical literature, the prolific tafsir literature that was generated in the pre-modern period. I also used modern commentaries as well. After examining all these sources and reflecting on them, I came to the conclusion, and I outlined the process by which I arrive at this conclusion. But my conclusion essentially was that the egalitarian position is the most credible and cogent one. It can be backed up by specific Quranic verses, and very importantly, by the actual wording within these verses, which, when interpreted without the mediation of the highly masculinist lens of the pre-modern exegetes, yield non-hierarchical meanings. So terms like qawamun, daraja, and fadl that have been typically been understood by male exegetes to mandate a gendered hierarchy that privileges men above women simply cannot, as I argue, simply cannot withstand a contextualized and linguistic study of these verses. Of course, it's a long discussion, as you know, in the chapter, so I obviously cannot get into the details. Also, I don't want this interview to serve as a spoiler. I do want people to read the book itself and the chapter itself. But the overall conclusion I arrive at is that actually these Muslim feminist scholars, some of whom may embrace the term feminist or not, but I call them feminists for reasons that I spell out in the chapter, or gender scholars if you want a more neutral term, they actually have done yeowoman's work in contributing to this discussion, keeping this debate alive. And I'm happy, very happy to have participated in that important conversation.
I found that really fascinating that your chapter, as you mentioned, wasn't just a summary, that you actually had a conclusion. So a lot of times in these handbooks, we're just summarizing the state of the field. But here you actually took a position in the conclusion. So could you speak a little bit more about that? You mentioned a little bit about some of the terms, and you're right. We don't want this interview to be a spoiler. We want people to engage, to actually read the chapter, but maybe give some examples of why you came to the conclusions you did. How does those words you mentioned, maybe some of the Quranic figures like Asiya or Maryam, you already mentioned earlier about Aisha as well. So could you speak about the evidences that you saw?
So one point I make, and I hope people really pick up on it, is that there isn't a single verse in the Quran that states that women as a whole, as a distinctive category, are inferior to men as a whole, or that all wives must obey all husbands, or women in general should obey men. Now, this is the fundamental premise of a patriarchy, that all women are subordinate to all men. It's not the qualities of the men we were talking about. They don't have to be particularly intelligent. They don't have to be particularly righteous. Just by virtue of being men, they command the obedience of women. I mean, this is the fundamental premise of a patriarchy. So if this premise is lacking, as I've shown that it does in the Quran, then we can no longer credibly maintain the position that there is a gendered hierarchy in the Quran. Then I turn to specific verses to show that there's actually a very strong egalitarian tone to the Quran. So, for example, Quran 4:1 talks about the nafs wahid, the single soul from which males and females are generated. right? So there's a hierarchy. The male and the female are created simultaneously. So ontologically, there is no difference between the male and the female. They were created at the same time by God, and they are equal to one another ontologically by virtue of their method of creation, right? This is a fundamental point. It's one of, I would think, one of the most important verses in the Quran that underscores this point unambiguously. Regardless of this unambiguous meaning that we retrieve in the modern period in particular, a number of medieval exegetes, male medieval exegetes, read a gendered hierarchy into this verse. How? Because, the verse in its plain sense simply does not promote that view. They brought in the biblical creation stories, right? Where the woman is created from the rib of Adam, Eve is created from the rib of Adam, and therefore she's considered a derivative being. And then also where, that particular passage in Genesis, which actually talks about how women are required to obey men, and this is then a blanket directive, and how, she's been punished for her participation in the fall. Certainly Christian theologians have read that as the leading to the notion of original sin, and how the woman, Eve, was caused the downfall and then allowed for original sin to take root. I think from after At-Tabari is disturbed by the fact that this story is not intrinsic to Islam, to Islamic sources, right? Certainly not in the Quran. But after At-Tabari, that kind of questioning of the origins of the story starts to dissipate. So that we find that in the commentary literature, it regularly becomes a part of the exegesis of Quran 4:1 and other verses that deal with the creation of Adam and his wife. And after a while, as you might imagine, by the time we get to the Mamluk period, this is taken for granted, that this is the proper understanding of the verse, despite the actual wording of these verses that simply do not suggest or state plainly that this interpretation was possible in the Quranic milieu. But as I argue in the chapter, if you're determined to find something, if you're determined to find a particular meaning, then you are going to find a way of making that interpretation fit. And so the biblical story provided the pretext, the exegetical pretext for articulating the theory of women's derivative and therefore inferior status with regard to men. In addition to Quran 4:1, we have the famous Quran 33:35, right, which talks about men and women who are equally rewarded for their faith and good deeds. No higher valuation of a man's actions over that of a woman. If they are going to carry out a good deed, then they get exactly the same reward for that particular deed. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's about as plain as it can be. It's another favorite verse of many Muslim, particularly feminist scholars these days, is Quran 9:7:1. And this verse basically states that men and women are equal partners. And because especially in the activity of commanding what is good and preventing what is wrong. And this has huge implications, I think, for the modern period. Now, I give kind of a rundown of some of the more prominent commentaries on this verse. And practically everyone agrees that the verse does point to the complementary roles of men and women in propagating Islam, in calling to goodness, and so forth. But they never actually talked about how this might have an effect on the public sphere. And I think the medieval, and I argued this, that the medieval male imaginary actually could not extrapolate such a meaning given the circumstances. But we're living in very different historical circumstances. And so Muslim feminist scholars often latch onto this verse saying, basically the sky's the limit in terms of what women can do, as long as it promotes what is good and as long as it prevents what is wrong. There should be no activity that is barred for women, because if they have the same capabilities and aptitudes as a man, then they're also qualified to compete in these arenas on an equal footing with men. And so this is a verse that has gained more prominence lately. But then again, once again, I think the medieval male imaginary could not get beyond the more limited understandings of this verse in their own milieus. There's also the Daraja verse, right? In Quran, it's chapter 2, verse 228. And daraja has been understood to be in an almost exclusively gendered sense. My argument is that, and many feminists have also argued in the same vein, is that we need to look at these terms holistically within the Quran. Where else does the Quran use the term daraja? And then can we find meanings that help to nuance kind of the traditional understanding of daraja in Quran 228, where it has been assumed that this points to a man's absolute superiority, right? Daraja is a rank or degree that a man has a superior rank above a woman under all circumstances. But the Quran also says, لِكُلٍّ daraja. Everyone has a rank vis-a-vis another person, right? I may excel in something that the other person cannot, but then the other person may have an attribute that I couldn't possibly approximate. So we all have, certain aptitudes, character traits, skills that another person may not have. See, in any given situation, there will always be people who have a certain daraja above another. Same thing with the notion of fadl, where when fadl is used on 434, for example, where the Quran says bima faddalallahu ba'dahum, and it comes right after the verse that talks about rijal qawwamuna ala nisa'i bima faddalallahu ba'dahum ala ba'd. This was also read as an absolute or total preference for men over women, right? So faddala means to prefer or to give superiority to someone in this case. That was understood to be an absolute rather than a functional superiority. So many of us have argued, and by no means is this viewpoint restricted only to a few people. Most Muslim feminist exegetes have argued, and actually starting also with Fazlur Rahman, it's part of the modernist way of engaging the Quranic text, right? Where you look at it holistically and bring in related verses that have a bearing on the meanings of these particular verses. And then Amina Wadud, as his student, continued this line of reasoning. Fazlur Rahman pointed out this is at best a functional superiority that it's pointing to, that in the medieval world, only men were the breadwinners. So men have been preferred only in the sense of being able to provide economically, financially for their families. Women did not have that ability, at least not to a large extent, in the pre-modern period. Times have changed, right? And women could conceivably be, and that's increasingly the reality in some parts of society, women could be the sole breadwinner of a family. Can they be regarded as the qawamat in their families, right? That they're the ones who are maintaining the family? The answer is yes, right? Because it's only in the context of the family where we have these particular expressions or locutions. If that situation should lapse, as it is increasingly in the modern world, where men are no longer the sole breadwinners, then we're talking about a functional superiority that was granted to men in the early period that is no longer valid, and that a woman could actually, by virtue of her function within the family, assume that position as well. The medieval exegetes also loved Quran 282, where it talks about a women's witnessing during a loan transaction, dain, right, in the Quran, where two women are then said to bolster one another. If one should forget, the other should remind her, and they are then deemed to be equivalent to one man. And I look at the various interpretations, but also point out that in actual application, even conservative jurists like Ibn Taymiyyah did not accept the idea that women were not qualified in general to bear witness in a court on their own authority. That means a single woman. And in fact, we know even the most conservative circles, single women can give testimony on matters that pertain only to women, right? Like in matters of, say, menstruation, pregnancy, and so forth. Women are assumed to be valid witnesses on their own authority. Then the notion of nushuz, which occurs also in 434, if we don't consider the two verses together that refer to women's nushuz in 434 and men's nushuz in 4128, I think we are led astray. Then we assume that we are really talking only about women's disobedience, and therefore they can be disciplined. But men's nushus don't count, or men are incapable of being nashes because of the fact that they are men and don't owe obedience to anybody. So I have a rather long and complex explanation of this verse, but ultimately I come to the conclusion that 434 simply cannot be invoked to support any kind of a patriarchal marriage where the wife is automatically assumed to be obedient to the husband under all circumstances. Here, it's only the nashizat who are being singled out, who can be reprimanded, right? So there, as we know, there are three phases to the way a husband then can react to this recalcitrant woman. Of course, what nushuz actually means has also been debated. Again, a long, complicated conversation about that. Essentially, I think there's a general consensus that nushuz means a certain kind of arrogance that you display towards your spouse, and unwilling to carry out the terms of your marriage, right? Marriage is described in the Quran as one that is based on mercy and affection between the husband and wife. And if that is lacking, and if one party is not willing to be a party to the marriage anymore, then there are ways of getting out of a marriage, right? Rather than let it continue unhappily. But nushuz is applicable then to both spouses. Both men and women can be guilty of nushuz. The three-pronged method of trying to bring the woman back into the fold ends with, I think, one of the words that, or an imperative in the Quran that's been highly contested even to this day. And that's the notion of beating, right? Derived from the root daraba, or the verb daraba, which can, however, be translated a number of different ways. People have become fixated on the sole meaning of daraba as beating, but I give an example in the book how daraba can simply mean to pat affectionately, lightly tap. There's an example of when the Prophet is very pleased by the answer that Mu'adh ibn Jabal gave him as he's setting out for his campaign in Yemen. And the Prophet was so delighted with his response, he actually darabat him, right? Now, it would be absolutely mistaken to translate that as he struck him or beat him up, black and blue. That's simply not possible. The context tells us that it has to be translated as patted him affectionately. He was so happy with the response. So why do we assume that, given the fact that the Quran emphasizes that an Islamic marriage must be grounded in love and mercy and affection between the wife and husband, why do we assume that a beating is in any way a feasible, a plausible meaning in this context? And I have to point out that even the pre-modern male exegetes took great care to explain this imperative as not to strike in any way to cause harm or pain to the woman. They always said it has to be very light tapping. And that's the translation I actually adopt in my rendition of the verse, because I think that's the only one that fits the context. We must reject the idea, as did a number of pre-modern male scholars. I think Ad-Darimi was totally against that idea. Abi Rabah, a successor, one of the Tabi'in, was absolutely against the idea, this verse giving any kind of license to husbands to beat their wives. And he also regarded hadiths that contain that understanding to be fabricated. So we have a lot of work to do in revisiting some of these very harmful interpretations that have caused Muslim women over the centuries in careless hands a lot of suffering. We need to challenge this, and we need to challenge it based on the text. Another word that I do want to point out, since you wanted me to expound on significant terms and how they've been, in my opinion, misinterpreted in the past. The meaning of qanit and qunut is very significant. Now, Mary is among the qanitin. Now, male exegetes almost uniformly, there are some outliers, but not too many, are almost unanimous in understanding, again, in verse Quran 434, the meaning of qanitat in that verse. So it describes righteous women and righteous wives as being as-salihat, righteous, and qanitat. Now, translation is critical here. A lot of people who look at only English Qurans will translate that as obedient. That's very misleading because then it leads to the idea that you're talking about obedience to their husbands. Qanitat means here obedient to God. When it's used for men, we never said it refers to obedience to a human being and certainly not to their wives, right? So Quran 33:35, for example, describes righteous women and men as qanitat and qanitun, and it means exactly the same thing. Now let's bring in Mary. Mary is described as one of the qanitin. She had no husband. This is Virgin Mary. Aren't they undermining their own interpretations by, I'm talking about the male exegetes here, by understanding qanita for a woman or qanitat as somehow mandating obedience to their husbands? Because if Mary is this prime example of a devoutly worshipful, obedient woman, obedient to God, then why are the male exegetes importing the husband into this equation? The husband has no role to play in this qunut, right? It's devout worship only of the one God. And if you look at classical dictionaries and modern dictionaries like Hanswehr, we find that meaning very clearly spelled out. So there are a number of these examples. I could go on. As you can see, I actually am very vested in this project of rereading and revisiting classical interpretations of key verses that have been used to create a very patriarchal family in the Islamic context. And I personally think it violates the Quranic ethos, and it has done a lot of violence to the whole gestalt of the Quran, the whole spirit of the Quran.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think there is so much there, and I hope you continue to write on these terms and on this point about the implications. So maybe we could end there on the idea of the implications of your specific article and the edited volume. Where does this help us as modern people? And then how does this inform your future work?
Well, I hope it will allow people to see that interpretive activity, first and foremost, is a multifaceted activity, right? There are, of course, certain verses in the Quran, that are totally unambiguous, but there are also verses in the Quran that lend themselves to different interpretations. And then as time changes and our historical circumstances change, we can actually retrieve new meanings. So the idea that the medieval exegetes pronounced for all times the correct interpretation of these verses, and they will be valid for all time, which is often the attitude you find among certain very conservative Muslims. It's simply not tenable. So we can still re-engage the Quran and look at the Quran through our own lenses, grounded in our own time and place, and still be able to come up with new meanings that does not do violence to the actual phrases being used in the text, the actual wording of these verses, and staying within the overall ethos of the Quran. And as many modernists and feminists will emphasize, the ethos has to be one that promotes justice and mercy. These qualities cannot be compromised moving forward. So I think if I've achieved just that in my own chapter, but also through the medium of the other chapters conveyed, again, the rich diversity in Muslim women's lives, and that they're themselves engaged in shaping their world, their societies. And this is something that has been going on since the inception of Islam, right? This is not some newfangled phenomenon. Then I think the handbook will have done its job. I think this will be a major contribution to the way we think of Muslim societies and the role of women in it. And as I argue in the book, we cannot claim to understand Islamic history then and the development of Islamic thought in general without understanding the contributions of women to that either textual corpus or to that whole enterprise, that women have always been fundamentally engaged with it. Their contributions may have been marginalized over time, but I think as more and more of these activities come to light, we will understand, how, again, the Islamic tradition has always benefited from the contributions of Muslim women alongside Muslim men. Yes, I hope to continue in this vein to a certain extent in the future. I'm very interested in probing further the notions of belonging and how gendered those notions were in early Islamic society. Or are we misreading early Islamic history when we assume that gendered notions of identity trumped other forms of identity? You do hear that, right? And some have a feeling that's probably not true. But I haven't done much probing into that topic. And I think of women like not just the prominent women in the Prophet's circle, but I'm thinking about women like Shifa bint Abdullah, who was appointed the Mahtasib in Medina by Omar. That's a pretty prominent public position for a woman to have in those days. Obviously, she was picked because she was qualified. And from what I read initially in some of the biographical literature, is that she was economically very savvy. She had a lot of knowledge about how markets worked. And it's obviously that got her noticed by Omar, and that Omar deemed it possible to appoint her to one of these very important positions. Now, the Muhtasib, in fact, became a very important position in later Islamic history, certainly in the Abbasid period onward. But you don't hear women Muhtasibs anymore after the first century of Islam. What happened? How did notions of belonging become so gendered so that women were not considered to be qualified for positions of leadership like that? We look at Al-Mawardi's Ahkam al-Sultan, and he specifically says women are not qualified to hold positions of imara, of leadership. And other scholars, when they are alerted to the fact that there were women like Shifa bin Abdullah, we can't just wipe them out of the historical record, their reaction often is, oh, that was an anomalous situation and we don't allow it anymore. How do we get from there to this particular point of view, right? So one day, inshallah, if I have the time and energy left in me, I would like to pursue that and kind of trace it diachronically in terms of how attitudes start shifting towards women. I've already done that, and not just me, many of my wonderful colleagues and peers have done that too. The work has been done in plotting these changes diachronically, and I'd like to contribute to that overall discussion by maybe looking at the checkered career of Shifa bin Abdullah down the line.
All right, wonderful. So thanks once again, Asma Afsaruddin, for joining us and sharing your remarkable edited volume, the Oxford Handbook on Islam and Women, and specifically your chapter on the modern readings of the Quran. And we look forward to being in touch. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks very much. Enjoyed talking to you.
And that was my interview with Asma Afsaruddin. There's so many things I enjoyed and appreciated in that interview. First, I really admire her role as the editor. As someone who has written different articles and books, being an editor is a really difficult task. It's following up with people, it's making sure that your volume has a consistent theme. It's also being able to know who is able to write in a particular subject or field. And Asma Saradin was able to put this remarkable volume together, which I really benefited from in writing my book. I also really admire how she's concerned with women's agency and women's voice. So in the edited volume, she collects a variety of different voices of Muslim women, of non-Muslim women who are interested in these topics. And I'm happy that she also included men. She realizes that this topic of women, Muslim women, is not limited to Muslim women. She doesn't want a discourse of only Muslim women speaking to each other, but she wants to have a discourse where men are included and are actively participating within that discussion and debate. And lastly, I really appreciated her interaction with the tradition. She's someone that looks very closely at the Quran, the exegetical tradition, and the early Muslim community. She mentioned several times Umar, the second caliph of Islam, and his interaction with women and how women challenged him, but he also appointed them as directors of the marketplace. And she also agrees with tradition, but also finds ways to challenge it and critique it. She is honest that tradition tried to argue that In Islam, beating was never permissible for women. At the same time, she's critical of male medieval exegetes who understood the Quran to be favoring men in absolute terms. So I really appreciate the way she nuances her interaction with tradition and how she finds meaning within it, but also the ability to critique it and find new interpretations for the modern world. So thanks so much for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. Please subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, students, and colleagues. You can also visit my website to learn more about my research and blogs. And I invite you to join my newsletter, where you can be updated on my current research, especially my forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. Thank you very much and take care.